Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. Now in this video I'm going to be discussing a particular subject regarding migration. Now we often speak about America being of stolen land, that we stole said land from the indigenous, because the Europeans essentially migrated and went elsewhere. What might have caused that? Well, for one, you could argue that the European people that specifically fled to go to America were seeking change. They were seeking to move away from a government they no longer liked. So they sought to explore and find a new beginning. Now, in the idea of this particular notion, creating the fact behind stolen land, which is this leftist ideology being preached regarding stealing land. And yet, what are you leftist individuals doing now that you don't like your government? You're moving elsewhere. So to say for one group to move somewhere because it didn't like the government back then, but now in present day times we see that in the rise of leftism is also the rise of what we call Trump dysphoria syndrome, which is based on being so triggered by just a man that is Trump. People have become so outrageously triggered, they're ready to start conquering again. They're ready to start moving elsewhere. They're willing to start essentially stealing other people's land. Why would you move away from the United States in this particular time if you were not actively seeking to have a new beginning? Just as your ancestors back then migrated to the Americas and founded these civilizations known as the Western civilization, yes, were there people already on this continent? Yes. But in the idea of specifically talking about stolen land, let's place one particular fact here. Back in my day of social studies, which I graduated maybe 14 years ago from high school. 14 years ago in high school, in social studies, they would talk about how Native Americans present within the Americas and Canada were already fighting over said territory. Their tribes were already at war, which means they were fighting each other in order to essentially say, whose land does this belong to? Now, what ended up happening? Well, rather than having a civilization that was predominantly based around building from sticks and cowhides, we then saw a civilization that was far more technologically advanced, that was able to easily conquer said indigenous, because they could build out of stone and steel, which in itself leaves landmarks which stand through the test of time. Whereas wood and cowhides, you're basically a migrant at that point. You were traveling people, which means you didn't sit in one spot. You were wanderers. And so if you move from spot to spot to spot to spot because you don't like the current state of the very spot you're in, well, I would actively say you're doing the same thing the Europeans did back then. As indigenous, you were already doing the exact same pattern of living, to seek to essentially move from somewhere you didn't like and move to somewhere you liked. And in the idea of building out of cowhides and sticks, you can essentially move rather quickly, but you never leave a trace. And in the idea that you never leave a trace, well, how can you say that that is yours if you can't prove it? Damn, this is crazy. Now, That must be some good stuff y'all were smoking back then, because to believe that something is yours just based on standing on it, well, what is the earth? Everyone stands on it. And to specifically say to one group, meanwhile all other groups were doing it, which was, I don't like it here, I'm going to move here. And because we have somehow separated or specifically segregated in our ways of thinking, we then see a divide, not just in our lives, we see a divide in the very teachings being taught. So, they might say trust the science, which if you're a more technologically advanced civilization, absolutely trust the science. You can conquer anything at that point. But, in the notion regarding the story itself, trust the facts, right? That's what they preach. Allow me to place a fact for you. If you were to look at the education system 14 years ago to compare it to today, you would see the subjects have changed. Not just in the history being taught, but the perspective from which it is being taught. You could actively see this the moment you shift between political parties, from right to left, from left to right. Essentially, history is continuously being rewritten. And so what is the actual fact behind history? Well, it never stops changing. So what is the actual fact? Because today's education speaks of land being stolen, whereas back in my day, we were taught the indigenous were already fighting over this land. And because we essentially found a way to better their lives in the idea that they were going to join or help us, well, here we are on said stolen land. Because we essentially wanted to go just as all humans. And if we want to say, well, the white man shouldn't do that, well, guess what? You're a racist then. Because if you start dividing in color, you're starting to segregate. And yes, as a mixed white man, I might have a certain darker tone to my skin. But in the idea that if I want to move from somewhere that's bad and go somewhere that's better, to better my life, how is that wrong? Because every single person has done it throughout the entirety of human life. Whether that be the Europeans coming to the Americas to conquer, to leave behind the shithole that England and France was back then. And we see that they essentially left somewhere bad to begin somewhere new, a fresh start. And in this particular fresh start, every single other culture has had this exact same way of living. It's called empires, and they were all continuously fighting each other all throughout the entirety of the earth. There's constant war between empires. And in this idea that, well, we'll excuse that empire, but the white empire, we gotta drive a nail into that one. Why is that? If the white man is supposedly the most racist, or is the white man the one that is the most racist towards which other races are the most racist towards the white man? And you might say, how can you say that? You don't know what people of color have undergone. Interesting. In terms of slavery? Because it wasn't white man that sold slaves. Those were Arabs that sold African slaves. And in terms of African slaves, even Africans were selling each other off as slaves. Mayans and Aztecs themselves had slaves. And you might say, well, I don't agree with slaves. Yet your nanny, your live-in nanny that's being paid to raise you in your wealthy lifestyle, which you claim you have so much knowledge about the world as a young individual, if you happen to be watching, you might see that this young nanny is being paid by your mother to essentially raise you so she doesn't have to. And what does that cause? Well, we see already the beginning of delegating. Bam! What is a slave? I don't want to do it. I need somebody else to do it. Obviously, if you're creating it out of free labor, that's itself slavery. But if you were to look at the basis around work, how do you build if you don't have workers? And we might see the rise now in, well, Western civilization. We have a lot of young individuals that are saying, I don't want to work that hard. I don't want to have to sweat. I don't want to have to be on my knees to perform a task. I don't want to have to use my body to perform a task. I want to be at home playing video games. And in this mentality of retracting within said room as an individual, do you see how easily triggered you are based on your quick dopamine fixes that now, even as a leftist individual, you essentially dive so deep into any trigger point? Well, unfortunately, you're probably raging at this point. I don't blame you. Now, if you want to shoot me, that in itself is an act of violence. Going from here to say, I want a new beginning. And you see this mentality, which we are specifically telling to white or Caucasian culture, you were wrong for doing the same thing that every other culture had done before. So what? If every culture had done it before, why is it that white man is made the example? If not white man being made the example. And so, without sounding white supremacist in this particular statement, I would actually argue that there is such a thing as just central, not pride based on race, pride based on gender kinks, but simply pride of being yourself, regardless of your orientation, skin color, body type, on and on and on. The true meaning behind existence is self-acceptance. But if we're constantly being told a story that is ever changing, specifically in the schooling system, why might we have all this confusion in children? Well, for one, the story never changes. The story always changes. Back in my day, we were taught the way I learned. In today's modern world, it's a completely different story. 14 years from now, once again, it will be a completely different story. So what's the actual fact behind history? If not his story. Whoever leads the country makes the people believe according to what he wants or she wants the nation to believe, which in itself causes an act of propaganda, learning to move people without ever having to essentially crack a whip in order to get them to move. You can just do it by planting them in front of a screen all day to the point they get so triggered, like a toddler, which is the mentality most young individuals have nowadays. You're already that easily triggered at me speaking this particular truth. And I'm completely calm and not angry at this particular point. But you as a viewer are. And so, why might you be angry? Is it because you're constantly being lied to? about everything, based on whoever runs the country, about everything. And so, can we all collectively have at least one story we can all agree on, a moral compass of sorts, and we can get to the facts from there. Thank you.